I am incredibly excited to welcome Mike Loiterman onto the SSI Executive Conversations podcast. I've had the opportunity to know Mike for probably about 4 years now, and he's really a subject matter expert in multiple areas. Um, so, Mike, as Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Zoll Medical Corporation, he was leading global regulatory strategy for life-saving cardiac management solutions, which included artificial intelligence and machine learning applications. Mike's expertise in AI governance and regulatory compliance really helped Zoll position itself as at the forefront of the of AI-driven medical technology. And obviously, AI is everywhere, and there's a strong focus on its being added for operational efficiency, even more so this year. But Mike, as a core member of that corporate AI governance and policy team, was pivotal in helping the company develop its first AI and machine learning policies, making sure compliance was evolving relevant to the regulatory landscape and fostering the responsible use of generative AI, of course, across all corporate functions. In addition to his pioneering work in the advancement of AI and machine learning enabled medtech, he has shaped regulatory strategies for a variety of products across a wide range of medical disciplines, driving regulatory approvals for cutting edge innovations. One of the things that when I first met Mike, I was amazed by the bandwidth of his experience, but his ability to bridge the gap between regulatory science and the business innovation has enabled organizations to achieve objectives while maintaining safety and efficacy standards as well. He's a highly sought after speaker and a subject matter expert. Mike has presented at leading quality regulatory conferences, shared insights on global compliance strategies and quality management and the intersection of innovation and patient safety. I did know this, but Mike told me this is his first podcast. So maybe this will be the first of many. But his expertise in AI driven medtech technology and regulatory best practices really made him a key voice in shaping industry discourse and future regulatory framework. Before the Zoll position, Mike founded Hallam Communications, which is a regulatory and quality system consultancy specializing in AI and machine learning enabled medtech and regulatory compliance solutions. It previously has been an executive leadership positions for Richard Wolf Medical Instrument Corp, Medacta, Pinnacle Biologics, and Great Adler Corporation, which is a company he founded to develop and commercialize breakthrough technologies for vascular access and hemodialysis treatment. So thank you so much for your time, Mike, and coming on and sharing your expertise with our following.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So first, happy birthday to you, which I learned about it from LinkedIn this morning. I didn't realize that, and I thought, oh, what a coincidence! It's his birthday today. But yeah, happy birthday to you. I won't ask you how old you are, though. But
well, I try to keep people guessing and by looking as youthful as possible. So I was asked, "What are you doing today?" I'm on your birthday. I said, "I'm excited. I've got a lot of different business initiatives and an awesome podcast that we're going to be doing." So thank you for the birthday wishes. I really appreciate it.
Great. Yeah.
So obviously, as I just shared, I mean, your introduction could have lasted and been 2 to 3 times as long as what it was, but you've got a diverse background in RA quality and compliance across various product categories of complexity and combined with really a strong business mindset. And I love some of the conversations that we've had around business, but you understand how to design compliance systems that not only ensure regulatory adherence, but also drive revenue through positive patient outcomes, which is what it, as a clinician, that's to me what it should all be about, start with. Can you share kind of best practices, your perspective on how do you achieve that balance from your experience?
Yeah, I think the key word that you used is balance. I mean, that's always the approach that I've taken is ultimately there is no business without revenue and profits and all of those things. But at the same time, there's also no business if the product you're making is terrible quality or it's subjecting patients to risks or you have all these problems in the field. So the two things really go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean I guess that's easy to say. That no one would disagree with that. I think anybody would agree and say, yeah, that's obvious. But the difficult part is making that work, and how do you get that balance? And that's obviously a complicated question, and all companies and all regulatory quality compliance people struggle with this balance. And so I would say that the approach that I've always taken has been, again, also easy to say, but not necessarily easy to implement, is to have, early and frequent and scheduled cross-functional communication. And so I think that takes discipline. It takes, a desire to sort of want to hear from the different sides. R&D has to be willing to listen to regulatory about the challenges that regulatory has, and regulatory has to be willing to listen to the challenges that marketing and sales and R&D and that they have, and to find a balance to figure out what is the path forward to having either a product or a change to a product fully implemented across all the disciplines, not just regulatory, but from a marketing perspective, and getting it through the FDA. All these things are a careful balance. And so I think those communication milestones, if you will, are really a key point to that, to stay. R&D is not able to hit this specific spec. And so, okay, what does that mean? Does that mean that we have to do additional testing? We have to go back to the FDA and say, this particular thing is not achievable, but here's what we can do, and here's why that is sufficient to answer your regulatory questions. I think along with that goes having established processes to help guide decision making. These situations, are dynamic and things change very, very quickly. And so having established processes and procedures and sort of ways of resolving these kinds of questions goes a long way to sort of taking a lot of the emotion out of it, and sort of the immediacy of like, okay, well, we have this big problem and we don't know what to do, and how are we going to resolve it, and we need an answer by this afternoon. And so if you have these established processes to kind of figure out, to say, okay, when tests fail, this is the way we address it, this is the documentation that we do, and here's the steps, and maybe we need to approach FDA again and say, again, we've had this issue and we want to comply with the requirements, but for this technical reason we can't. And again, here's what we can do. And I think that goes a long way with FDA.
I think
The other thing, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no worries. It's like, as you were talking about that, and I don't have any desire to beat up certain companies in our industry per se. It's like you were talking about that. I was thinking about one pharma company that, in terms of the opioid crisis, that knew that it was incredibly addictive, and put that out there anyway. There's a couple other companies that kind of came to mind. I remember getting my MBA. There was a case study in the law portion of it where it was the auto industry, and they knew there was an issue with the vehicles, but the cost to pay the fines was cheaper than the cost to do the recall. Some people lost their life, and there's a lot of issues with that. So I don't think most companies, and I'll be at LSI Emerging MedTech here in a couple of weeks. A lot of amazing innovators. It's a great place for thought leaders and new technology and innovation to be there. And most people, they're not starting out with the goal of getting a warning letter or causing issues when it comes to, they have a desire to bring value to the place. But I think at the same time, we're going to talk about the cost of warning letters and the challenges there. Not having the communication and a company that values quality as a stakeholder at the executive table. I just had a conversation with the VP yesterday. We were talking about a company she was at. It was like, I knew within 3 months I had to get out of here because they were wanting me to sign off on things that I was like, I'm not signing off on that. And within 6 months, she went someplace else, and she was telling me. And then 2 years later, she was sitting in her office and got a phone call about that company because they were in big trouble. So how do you gauge that moving into a company at first and have that conversation with the executive team about how you create those reaching across the aisle and keep away from silos that lead to issues?
I think ultimately, maybe I'm too optimistic. I think ultimately people want to do the right thing and they want to comply, but they don't always understand what's involved in doing that. And the assumption in my experience has always been like, well, in order to do the quote unquote right thing, it's going to be massively expensive and take a huge amount of time and dramatically impact the business. And sometimes that's true. That is absolutely totally dead on, but not always. And sometimes it's I won't say it's easy to do the right thing. But it's not as difficult as perhaps it might seem. And there are multiple ways to get to the right thing. And I think if people were to slow down and say, you know, okay, we have this problem. There's multiple ways to resolve this. What is a balanced approach? And someone might argue with the balance of the approach later. FDA may say, well, you didn't balance enough in terms of the risk to patients or the design or whatever it may be. Or someone might come back and say, hey, we spent way too much money solving this problem and ultimately it led to nowhere. But at least if you approach it from the perspective like, okay, let's not panic. Let's not immediately assume that this is going to cost millions and millions of dollars to resolve. And let's not necessarily take the perspective that we should hide or cover these things up. And maybe we just need to sort of have a more balanced approach to sort of proactively resolving our problem and proactively engaging with regulators to resolve this issue. I also would say regulators need to sort of respect that. And when companies do come forward, you know, if they're completely smacked down and totally, you know, punished in such a way that it makes it, you know, other companies see that and say, well, we're definitely not going to do that because those guys were totally hammered and it crushed their business. Mm-hmm. So I think FDA and other regulatory bodies, they try and understand that. But I think, you know, I think we'll talk a little bit about this later. I think it's about putting it in the context that they can understand.
No, I think that's really smart, and I think it's another reason why it's so important to hire for culture, and that you have to have people that have the technical skill and the understanding that you need relevant to functionality of position. However, you can have somebody that is a 10 out of 10, 12 out of 10 in terms of what that looks like, but if they don't play well with others, they don't have high emotional intelligence, they're not open to seeing things from other people's perspective with a personal why that matches the mission or the vision relevant to company value prop, then you shouldn't hire them because it leads to less communication, more silos, and the higher the employee engagement people care about the product, the more positive they're going to be in problem solve, because we know that there's going to be challenges no matter what they are. And I think that's a great segue into the next question that I had planned to ask you about, because when you look at warning letters, the data shows that over 85, 90% of the issues come back to leadership, wrong talent, misinterpretation of guidelines. So with warning letters costing companies over $1 million per incident and exceeds $6 billion annually in medtech, leadership and talent, again, really key factors around regulatory failures, recalls, 483. So given, you know, your extensive experience around that, you've dealt with scenarios where you inherited those and fixed them. What's your insight, you know, that you'd share around the common causes from your experience with warning letters?
Yeah, I mean, My interpretation of warning letters is that they're a tool that FDA uses to communicate with industry. And there's a lot of complicated reasons and some simple reasons that FDA issue warning letters. I think FDA, I'm not from FDA, I can't claim to speak for them, but I can say I think that they view warning letters as a way to tell companies that they either have or haven't done something, or that they have a gross misunderstanding, or in some cases they purposely disregarded some or all of the quality system regulation. So I think that's how they view warning letters, and I think that they also view them not necessarily in the context of a specific company, but also as a communication tool to other companies and that do or make similar types of products or work in the same sort of discipline. Obviously, FDA has their their fingers on the pulse of all kinds of emerging issues that specific companies wouldn't know about. You know, they get the MDR reports and they do their trending, and so they can be aware of, hey, this particular discipline is seeing a lot more complaints about this particular topic. And so that's something that we, FDA, with the mandate to protect public health, need to get on. And we're going to take whatever steps are necessary to address that. And so if we have to issue a warning letter to one or multiple companies, then that's what we're gonna do. So that said, I think it's a tool sometimes that FDA, or not just FDA, but just the concepts in general aren't always used in the most effective ways. I've seen companies that have received warning letters for things that were admittedly wrong or things that needed to be improved or changed, but it was presumably pretty clear that the company had the best intentions and maybe their execution wasn't perfect or thorough enough, but it wasn't as though they were trying to hide something or completely disregard the requirements. And so those kinds of warning letters are costly and time consuming for not only industry, but also FDA. FDA has to devote resources to responding to these requests and answering questions and coming back to reinspect and all these other things. And so I think in those situations, maybe there's an alternative approach or an alternative solution that FDA can think about or deploy. I don't know what that is, because ultimately human nature is human nature, and people are going to pick the path of least resistance if there's not a meaningful consequence for changing behavior. So I think that's another reason why FDA uses warning letters, is to change behaviors, and that the more of a burden, if you will, that they make it, the more likely it is to change behaviors. And so companies need to understand that. Don't put yourself in that situation where FDA says your behaviors need to be changed and you're not capable of doing it on your own.
One of my mentors and good friends, when I was in corporate America, that I reported to a VP, used to always tell me, never forget you're paid for behavior. You're paid for behavior. And you had said earlier about having systems, processes, and you look at design history file, so many different warning letters become design history file, or through an acquisition, merger and acquisition, and then the design history file hasn't been looked at in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. Many issues come from that, or in trying to integrate with quality management systems. So having the right systems in place, communication, validation, to try to prevent those things. But to your point earlier about people, they're not out trying to do the wrong things. The data shows fraud is certainly one of them, but more of the rest of them revolve around the wrong talent, cutting corners. Maybe they're being pressured in terms of commercial launch, but there's issues with the design controls, with the design history file, teams that aren't working well together. Certainly in the last few years, with software as a medical device and a medical device and all these things, I think it's been over 50, 60% of the warning letters have been relevant to software. or software issues. So what is your advice as a leader in terms of how you should look at hiring your regulatory quality compliance talent?
Yeah, I think there's no magic way to deal with this. Warning letters aren't going to go away. Compliance problems aren't going to go away. But I think experienced leadership is key to minimizing the risk with these things, because they can help facilitate communication with FDA or other regulatory authorities. And so that is, I think I can speculate and say, let's say 50% of the time, FDA is willing to listen to a company's response and willing to not necessarily jump straight to a warning letter, but that depends on the company's response. And so, and how um, targeted it is to what FDA is looking for. Does this company understand the seriousness of the way we as FDA are viewing this situation? And when FDA doesn't hear the communication in the way that they're wanting and expecting, then that's when they say this company doesn't get it. For whatever reason, they're just not getting it. And so, that takes experience to say, okay, FDA isn't just looking for a Band-Aid on this particular thing. They're wanting the company to look at this from a systematic perspective to say, it's bad that this happened, and it's fine that you're going to fix it, but how did it happen in the first place? What systems broke or failed or didn't exist to allow this to happen? And I think if you again, the experience and the leadership, when you have the ability to explain to FDA, we know what happened and here's how we're going to fix it, then I think the risk of the warning letters is reduced.
I was really surprised when I got into the industry on this side, and I don't know that I know specific numbers or I've seen this, but it comes up a lot, how many letters and issues come from CAPAs. So the issue's been identified, the CAPA's been started, but it's not executed on or finished. That really surprised me.
Yeah, I think, a lot of companies I've worked with and for, kappa is a hard concept to understand. Companies have different perspectives to say, well, we should have a certain number of kappas, or we should have a certain below a certain number of kappas, or they should be closed within a certain period of time, or they overlay these arbitrary metrics on top of kappa. And what I've always tried to explain is that the idea of kappa is to address these things thoroughly, and so that issue can never happen again. You put in place the guardrails to make sure that the thing that caused this issue can never happen again. So that's going to take some time, and that's okay. I think FDA is okay with kappas that span a long period of time. I think they're looking for the documentation to say, this is what's happening, we're actively working on this, and here are the results of our findings. And I think they tend to get upset when it's just buried and, yeah, we've got a kappa, but it hasn't been looked at or touched in 8 months. That's where you run into problems, because it says to FDA, not only did you have that problem, but your process for dealing with problems is kind of broken if you're not addressing these things.
Yeah, especially, and I mean, the age of the metaverse, outcomes and analytics, it's constantly making sure that you're utilizing the data that you have. I had a podcast with Augusto, Chief Medical Officer, and he was talking about all this data, rich data, clinical outcomes data that they'd had for a decade, and they really hadn't done anything with it before he got there. And they were like, somebody made the comment, like, should we publish this? He's like, oh my gosh, there's so much rich information here. Yeah, we should publish this. We should be utilizing this in different ways. So looking at the data and then figuring out how you continually make it best practice.
Yeah. Yeah. And not only that, but is it the right data, and is it correct and accurate? It's funny that you bring that up, because earlier this morning, or maybe it was last night, I saw this thing that, Jeff Bezos was giving this interview, and he was talking about metrics surrounding customer complaints at Amazon when he was the CEO. And he received a report that said Amazon addresses customer calls within 60 seconds or something along those lines. And so in the middle of the meeting, he stopped what he was doing and he picked up the phone and called the customer service. And he's sitting there and he's waiting and waiting and waiting. And, this whole meeting with all his executives, I can only imagine what the guy responsible for customer service was sort of thinking, but I'm sure he was sweating pretty hard. So it went on for 10 minutes. And he said, the whole point is to say, like, our process for this data is wrong. It doesn't take 60 seconds. It takes 10 minutes. And so why are we reporting that it takes 60 seconds? Something is not right here. So fix that.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be the guy on the other end that answered the call. But so regulatory affairs, the complexity there. I love regulatory affairs because of access to markets and sort of that pathway and doing it in the right way, but emotional intelligence, de-escalation, and how you manage stakeholders. But in some scenarios, there's aspects obviously of ambiguity and then conflicting demands. And you spoke to this a little bit earlier, because you have to put a safe and effective product out. And from a quality standpoint, sometimes things happen that you can't just shut everything down. You've got to fix it in degrees, maybe. What are the most significant challenges that you've faced in RAQA and compliance, and that you've then been able to successfully navigate? Maybe sharing an example with us.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge with this topic is that most people don't really understand what regulatory affairs and quality assurance professionals do and the value that they can bring. Sales, marketing, engineering, manufacturing, these are all well understood business activities. And even if you don't work in those disciplines, you have a pretty good idea of what they do and how they relate to the business. And in most cases, they have a fairly direct line from what they do to revenue. And it's just easy to understand. What does sales do? They generate revenue, and it's easy to measure the progress and how good or bad they're doing. But with regulatory affairs and compliance and quality and even IT, I think to some degree, they're all somewhat ambiguous terms and complex. And, the average person doesn't always necessarily understand what is quality doing to help the business. It seems like they're always slowing things down and rejecting product, and that just costs us money. And so I think that, what the perspective I always tried to bring is that these disciplines are all force multipliers. And so with smart quality regulatory compliance decisions, the savings that can be realized or the accelerated revenue that can be realized is tremendous. If as a regulatory professional, I can bring your product to market and get approval for it 1 month, 2 months, 6 months ahead of something else, then that's all revenue that in some ways is directly attributable to regulatory affairs. It could be hundreds of millions of dollars just by, very sort of simple regulatory strategy. Or by the same token, quality. If quality can set things up so that they catch problems before they're released to the field, same thing. I mean, what's the cost of a lawsuit from a single product failure? I mean, the costs of that are unknowable and incalculable. So
I mean, absolutely, you have to reverse engineer. That's a big thing that we have to do in terms of education on working on a position. It's not as certainly it's about, if you're working on a VP role, you bring 3 candidates that everything makes sense, but it's all the math you have to do to get to those people. You may start with 150 candidates, or depending on the complexity of the role, but you look at Philips, and I hate this as an example because I was involved with the Trilogy ventilator back when I worked for them, but that situation based on that toxic foam and the issue with the design and then the manufacturing process has cost 1.3, well over $1.2 billion, and a lot of lives as well. And so to me, you have to do the inverse you kind of have to look at it, reverse engineer what the potential risk is, and factor that into the wording that you just said. I can't remember exactly what you said, but you said a cost, like a factor. It's a
Oh, the ratio between, you know, like in Philip's case, like, okay, I don't know the specifics of what that issue would have entailed to fix, but it's got to be way, way, way less than 1.2 billion
yeah.
dollars.
And I'll share an example here real quick that probably 4 or 5 years ago, we had conversations working with a top 20 global IVD company, and they were saying that for regulatory affairs manager positions that they really struggled with them. Had a recent positions open a year, and was talking to them about comp. And really, the comp for this one role was $25,000, essentially below the market. And they've got a new product coming on. And I just asked them. I said, and they wanted this person to sit in a high cost of living place. And I said, have you thought about having somebody remote travel or hybrid? No, we haven't. This was obviously before the pandemic. And I said, well, think about, have you thought about maybe instead of worrying about the cost and the location, really focusing on the right talent relevant to risk? And because if these products or certain products, and you look at IVD, right, there's a lot of different categories and products on the portfolios. Like, have you hired, they had, I think, a couple of new things that were coming down the pipeline. Have you already hired a sales team? They were like, yeah, we've already hired 9 sales reps. I said, well, if you hire this position and let's say you get somebody that's $20,000 below the market that's willing to do that, and then there's an issue with the submission, and we know 50% of 510Ks are not acknowledged the first time. So what is that going to do to your revenues? And what is that going to do to those reps who you've already hired if they can't hit? And the one HR leader was like, wow, it would be really bad. We've never really thought about it that way, but that's, to me, the way you have to look at it for those type of roles, because it is significantly important.
Yeah. Well, I think that gets back to the part where I was saying I don't think folks understand what it is that we can do and the value that is brought there. And your example is perfect, because like if you said, what if I could increase the odds that your product is brought to market 3 months early and it's only going to cost you $25,000 extra, would you take that? Of course.
Right. Absolutely. Yes. As I'm moving to the next question here, but one chief medical officer and I were talking a couple months ago, and he's got a ton of experience. He's really an SME in his particular area, worked at the FDA before. And he's like, it's amazing how many companies will do the same project twice instead of just doing it right the first time, or paying the compensation you need to pay to get the right talent to do it right the first time. But